Welcome to Theories and Problems in Visual Art. This is history lecture number 2. How does art history appear to you? I have about 5 slides just to introduce the theme, and then I have a whole bunch of slides of what I call intuitive drawings of art. Intuitive drawings of art history. So this is actually an exercise. These first 2 lectures are something that I recommend for everybody who's starting to learn art history. I do it in all my own classes, and I've also held this exercise in different countries. It seems to me really useful that before you start to learn names and cultures and dates and periods and styles and so on, that you try to make a drawing, an intuitive map of the way that art history seems to you. In the classes that I teach, often we do this at the beginning of the semester, and then at the end of the semester or the end of the year when we've done a lot of art history, you do it again and see how it changes. The drawing can include everything that you think about in art, and the idea is to arrange it the way it's arranged in your own mind. And the purpose is that when you start to learn, you have this intuitive drawing or intuitive map to think about so that you don't lose your own sense of how things are. So art history is full of these maps, charts, and timelines and things like that, and I have a lecture on them coming up the way they are in art history textbooks and so on. And when you read about them in art history classes, they can influence the way that you picture art history. But if you make your own drawing at the beginning, and maybe another one sometime later, like at the end of the class, then you can keep track of how art history appears to you as opposed to how it appears to professional art historians and teachers, like you see in this picture. So the idea of this drawing, how to make it, it should be honest and it should be complete. So if you spend more time watching TV than looking at art, and actually I think I do most of my life, I probably have to admit that, then TV should be huge in your drawing. If you spend a lot of time with images on social media, they should also be included. The idea is to make a fair, representative picture of your own mental universe of visual objects, including mass media and art history, whatever it is that you happen to know, that you happen to be interested in. And that's just, this is my random example for the internet of the kind of thing that could, if it's something that you look at, should definitely show up. It's an Edo period yokai that became popular during the COVID crisis. The only rule of these intuitive drawings or maps is that you can't use an ordinary map for a basis or an ordinary timeline. And that's because those come in a predetermined shape, and the idea is to let your imagination find its own form. So the whole rest of this lecture is just a series of slides of examples of these intuitive drawings. And I start out with a couple that I drew just in order to show them to a class one time. So this was a night sky that I drew as an example. And it's labeled with things that I was thinking about when I drew the picture. Some of them were from teaching, some were personal things at the time. I was researching scientific images. So the center, like the moon in the center, is natural images, things that I was looking at the time. The drawback of doing this is that the picture like this, like with stars and galaxies or whatever, the drawback is that everything's randomly arranged. And what you really want to try for is to arrange things in such a way that they correspond with the way you think about them. So a really useful strategy, which a lot of people like to use, is to draw a landscape. It doesn't matter in these intuitive maps what you happen to know and what you don't. So you don't, if you were to draw a landscape like this, you don't want to put like the ancient Middle East far away like I did there. You don't want to do that because you haven't studied it yet. You want to do that because you don't feel at home with it. So this is about how you feel about parts of history, not about what you know about them. So my idea drawing this one was that I'm sort of standing on the beach, and I had recent Western painting there on the beach, on the shore, because I feel comfortable about it. And then as I was imagining sort of walking into the water, as the water gets deeper, it's things that I feel a little less comfortable with. So I actually have my PhD is in Renaissance art. So the Renaissance, which is right there in the, not too far out in the water, should really have been on dry land, but it's the way I feel about someone like Leonardo. So even though I've studied Leonardo, I don't have an intuitive sense of what he was like as a person. Like I couldn't really predict, as it were, what he might do next. If you showed me one thing, I wouldn't be able to predict the next thing. So I don't feel like I understand him. So he's in deeper water. And things that are in very deep water, things that I might be able to, lecture on them, I would have facts and so on, but I wouldn't really be at home with them. So this is it's about feeling at home with things. So it's not how much you know, it's what you feel. So here's a drawing that was done by a student in Hangzhou. When I was visiting the academy in Hangzhou, I did this exercise as well. So she pictures herself in the middle there at a crossroads. Straight down to the bottom is a road leads past great masters of Chinese ink brush painting. And those figures there are as famous in China as, say, Leonardo is in the West. And that road ends at Dunhuang, which is a site in China that has cave paintings in it. So in her mind, ink brush painting leads back to cave painting. To the lower left, there's a road that leads down to Egyptian art all by itself in her mind. And to the lower right, there's another road that leads to more Chinese art. Actually, it's labeled Qing and Han Dynasty. And some of you may know those two dynasties are actually very far apart in time. So an historian wouldn't connect them. But this is an intuitive map. In her mind, they were connected. The interesting part's the top part of the map. So at the upper left, there's a road that leads past major Western artists and ends up in Greece and Rome, up in the corner there on the upper left, prehistoric Europe, Mesopotamia. It's a little strange, but that's the idea that she had. The artists that are on the road, like Matisse, Gauguin, Mayol, Da Vinci, that's a kind of canon of artists that is familiar in some Chinese institutions because they're often taught in Chinese schools. It's a different list of artists to emphasize they would find in North American schools. It's a product of the first generations of Chinese artists that went to Paris to study in the 1920s, and they've had an influence on Chinese teaching. So there are different narratives of art in different parts of the world, which is a theme that runs through all of these history lectures. So that was for her a kind of Western genealogy. And then, as you could see, the last road leads up to the upper right toward modern art, but she figures she can't get there. She says, it's a river, I can't cross it, but I will try. So a lot of times these maps turn out to be ways to be honest with yourself about your feelings for some art. I've had a number of the students draw these and be very negative about modern and contemporary art because you can be honest when you draw these. This was done by a student at the School of the Art Institute. So he and his friends are in the center of the picture, standing under these giant tombstones haunted by abstract expressionist artists. Up at the top, those ghostly figures are labeled Rothko, Pollock, de Kooning. In the far background, there are mountains underneath the sun there, labeled Roman and Greek, and that's very common in my experience in these drawings, that Greek and Roman art seems to people to be very distant, hard to understand, very far away. Then there's this road that leads through the entire landscape, and it's not labeled. And I asked this guy what it was, and he said that's Surrealism. So that's an interesting thing because Surrealism in art history is a 20th century movement. But to this guy, Surrealism is a kind of possibility for art that exists in all periods. And that's an honest representation of the way he felt. There's Surrealism in all different periods. And also it corresponds with a way of thinking about Surrealism that has been in existence since Surrealism. That's the kind of thing you won't read in an art history textbook, that you could make surreal art, that it's always existed and so on. But it's something that, it's a way that Surrealism exists in people's imaginations. And the most interesting part of this is down in the foreground, he drew two UFOs with these goggle-eyed aliens inside them. One is labeled African art and the other is Chinese art. So I told him in the class that some people might find that offensive, but he said, okay, but like I had told him to do it because he said it was the way he felt. He could never understand African or Chinese art. So fair enough, that's the way he felt about them. It's also, these drawings can help you to alert you to ways that you might want to, things that you might want to think more about. You might want to look more closely at African art to realize they're not aliens, but that's up to him. This one by a student named Sam Stark, also at the School of the Art Institute. It's about the non-Western art that he learned in his 1001 survey class. So at the bottom there, it says, art I learned in Jim's class. And the guy, Sam, is hugging this art that he learned in my class, but he's about to be crushed by this giant labeled Eurocentrism, which is also giving him the finger. So It turns out that it's actually very difficult to avoid Eurocentrism and to free art history of Eurocentrism, and it's something that's going to be also a theme through all of these history lectures, and which we'll come to toward the end, lecture H23 especially. Here's another student who was thinking about Eurocentrism, this time because she learned it, she says, in North Carolina before she came to the School of the Art Institute. She's tired of, quote, the old white guy's bathtub filled with, quote, Eurocentric art history, which is still cool, but the bathwater's dirty and stale. It says that right in the bathtub. The faucet on the left says, the goddamn North Carolina public school system, which gave her this Eurocentric art in her tepid bathtub. And up above is the, quote, shelf of non-Western bath items, which includes, quote, Indian art conditioner and South American body wash. And so she says on the right, the plan is to step out of the old white guy's bathtub and reach up to the shelf of non-Western bath items. It's a really good one. Some students use these intuitive drawings to show how they are putting off studying their own cultures. I have two examples of that. So here is labeled Ideal, a European-style Madonna and Child, and surrounded by a cloud with European art in it, oil paintings, ancient ruins, Downton Abbey. Then there's a smaller figure at the right, like a smaller saint, and it's labeled Snooty Contemporary Art, Judging Me Hard, and that's because the student didn't like contemporary art. But the main moral of this is down at the bottom, where she's copied two angels that are from a Raphael painting, and she writes, my Asian identity that I am ignoring. So like a number of East Asian students, she had studied Western art history in her country before she came to the United States, and she was feeling guilty for taking a class or classes which had yet more Western art in them. So this was her feeling guilty, and she's got a little bit fuddled at the bottom there. One more example of that. This is a detail of the left-hand part of one of these drawings where the student had put a strip of Post-its that are drawn with different styles up the left-hand side of her drawing. And if you lifted them up, you saw underneath like Neoclassicism, Rococo, Baroque, Mannerism, so on, all the different styles that she had been learning. But over on the right of the drawing, she had a desert cemetery with the art of her own country. She was Mexican, which she had been ignoring. So there's a grave, Frida Kahlo, Diego Rivera, and down at the bottom she wrote, willing to reach over and understand my identity even if everything else topples over and blurs. She was also feeling bad for having studied non-Mexican, mostly European art in Mexico and then coming to Chicago and studying more of it. So these drawings can also be a nice chance for you to think about things that you might want to think about that are maybe like haunting or something. Some of the most useful drawings are honest about including everything, like social media and stuff like that. This is an example of that. So the sun is labeled easy and sunny, and the rays of the sun are labeled impressionism, cartoons, children's illustrations. And then there's a speech bubble to the upper left there, and it's labeled things I feel comfortable talking about, advertisements and Instagram. And the figure herself is labeled things I identify with, grids, figurative work, zines, and so on. And then the shadow of the figure is things I walk past in museums, grids, figurative works, things I walk past in museums. And then at the bottom, which is a cutoff in this drawing, she had a little strip at the very bottom, things I hate, cubism, and, sorry, the things I hate, I see it now, it's on the right. She had scratched them out, and there was also more of them on the bottom that she had scratched out, all the things she hated. So it's very inclusive. It's honest. It has the things that she didn't think that SAIC would value, and then she had other things that she knew that SAIC was valuing, but that she didn't value. Here's a student who's very conservative and very proud of it, and like most large art institutions at the School of the Art Institute, we have a fairly large number of more or less conservative students who are interested in past art movements of the past. That's a fairly common thing to see in these drawings. This one is a particularly entertaining example because of this sort of Pope, actually. that's drawn here. And this Pope is holding the Renaissance in one hand. In his left hand, I guess it's an orb with the Renaissance written on it. And then he's raised his other hand, and he's got the Baroque up there as a sun, and it's labeled culmination of art underneath it. And also, for good measure, a little a label that says, I am the art. And then all the awful modernist stuff that the student didn't like is under the academic art in an area called Honor of Art Abomination. It says that in a circle at the bottom, which includes postmodernism, performance, and abstraction. And I've seen more violent drawings as well. I've seen one where a student was going along with her friends in a boat, and they go under a guillotine, and the guillotine cuts all their heads off. And I asked the student what it was, and she said, "Oh, that's like modern art, but it's okay. Like, I'm still in the boat. At least I'm still going." And I said, "That's nice." And then she drew in the rest of it, and it turned out the boat was headed for a waterfall, and they were all going to die, and that was labeled postmodernism. Here's a student who's struggling up a stairway of art toward cultured artist land. It says at the top landing up there. His feet are in buckets, probably of cement, I guess, which are marked Italian Renaissance and frescoes or whatever. And there's an airborne delivery of, quote, early 2010s YouTube videos to help him along. So I've also seen a number like this where art history itself is suffering, but there's a kind of aspirational goal, and presumably there would be that something would help you. In this case, maybe it's videos, and that you would get somewhere worthwhile, maybe, at the end. So here's a guy diving off the SS High School in his big boy pants, I should say, with his families watching him from a porthole in horror. And he's diving into the ocean of art with the, quote, professor watching happily at the upper left there, Professor Fish watching happily. Each lesson is a spear with a spear gun that he can use to kill different kinds of art. So the spear gun itself is labeled your history class, and the spear that's in it is labeled each lesson. And then all the monstrous fish that he's going to kill with his art history spear guns are all going up, getting ready to attack him. So some of these drawings, give a sense that art history is actually a subject of real anxiety, but there are other drawings where there's no anxiety at all, like this one. A really friendly drawing by another student, Kate Hefferon. So she's on the left, on the lower left down there, she's got a figure labeled me, and she's got her good friends with her. She feels pretty comfy around. Italian Renaissance, Impressionism. In the middle, modern and contemporary art, it's exclusive and intimidating, but still she's there, or there's a group anyway. And on the right is the only thing that she doesn't like, and that's Cubism. And Cubism is like waving, wants to be friends with me, but I rejected it. And as in like the UFOs of that other drawing, there are two like Canada Goose art periods flying overhead that she doesn't quite understand because she has a lack of knowledge. But generally, like, it's a very friendly kind of a thing. So sometimes these are, made like journeys and they're full of danger, like that last one, and sometimes they're fairly friendly. And last of all, this is one which is done in a fabulous old-fashioned cartoon style, mostly a mainly friendly one, because mostly in this case, the only problem is overeating, eating too many different kinds of art. So here she is, not really sure about modern art, Picasso, graffiti art. She's labeled it really creepy / grotesque. But then again, there are hearts around two of the figures. It's only her that's not so sure. She's got question marks and X's and stuff. And her favorite stuff is realism, Walt Disney, Jeff Koons, commercial art, and Yo-Yo Kusama, which is kind of a funny choice. So basically kind of happy drawing. So, I mean, this could go on and on. I have hundreds of these I've collected. I find them almost always to be really useful because you at first don't, sort of think, what is the shape of art history? Does it have a shape? But it's really helpful to have this kind of thing in mind as you go on through your art history class. I absolutely recommend these. And if anybody makes one, I would be happy to look at it. You can just get in touch with me and have a look at it. And you should definitely, though, if you make one, keep it, and at the end of the year, at the end of your class, make it again using some of the things that you've learned to see if they've actually found a place in your imagination or not. Because sometimes art history and your own imagination are like oil and water. You can mix them to make the vinaigrette, and then after a while they just fall apart again. And other times, though, the art history really sticks and becomes part of the picture.